just to make sure we're all on the same page here. This video is the second part of my response to those who try to promote the idea of herd immunity as the solution to the crisis that is COVID-19. It was prompted by a Facebook post from a professor here in Israel who is often invited to speak on TV about pandemic-related policy issues. The first and more important part of this response was about how, to the best of my understanding, those who try to promote this idea are either lying or have literally no idea what they're talking about, and how that should mean that they should never be taken seriously, let alone be invited to speak as experts. Mind you, this information is true for October 2020. There is definitely a chance that at some point the relevant scientific conclusions might change. If by the time you watch this a vaccine has been developed, or it's been discovered that past illness does lead to permanent or longer-term immunity for COVID-19, the idea of herd immunity might be worth discussing. And this is exactly what this video will be about. As I said, the first part is far more important than this one, especially if the science hasn't changed yet, but also if it has, because even if it now makes sense to discuss herd immunity as a viable option, it's still important to think about how we should look at those who pushed for it back when it wasn't. So if you haven't watched it yet, you should really go watch the first part. The link to that part should be in the card over there and in the description over there. Go, watch it, I'll wait. So now that we understand why we can't speak of herd immunity, so long as individual immunity hasn't been shown to be a thing, what about if we get to the point where herd immunity is even possible? Should we strive for it? My name is Tal, and this is Due Diligence. So, here's a little reminder. Herd immunity or community immunity is defined by the CDC as a situation in which a sufficient proportion of a population is immune to an infectious disease through vaccination and/or prior illness to make its spread from person to person unlikely. Even individuals not vaccinated, such as newborns and those with chronic illness, are offered some protection, because the disease has little opportunity to spread within the community. The first thing to get out of the way is this. If we're talking about immunity through vaccination rather than through prior illness, that is, if a vaccine has been developed and if that vaccine is safe, then we should vaccinate as many people as we can, even beyond the threshold of herd immunity, just like with any other dangerous disease that we have a vaccine for. Vaccines save the lives of those who get them, and when enough people get them, they also save the lives of those who can't get them. Once a vaccine is developed, we should absolutely get vaccinated if we can. In the process, the population will probably get to herd immunity, which will mean that those who cannot be vaccinated for whatever reason will also be protected. If vaccination's on the table, we aim for full vaccination and we get herd immunity in the process. So, as a quick summary of what we've covered until now, so long as individual immunity hasn't been established as a possibility, herd immunity could be an unreachable goal, and striving for it might mean all pain, no gain. Whereas if a vaccination is found, we should vaccinate everyone, regardless of herd immunity, which thankfully will likely follow. But that's not the main reason we should get vaccinated. Those are the cases where the verdict is supposed to be easy. And I say supposed to be because, on the one hand, we see that even now, when immunity for COVID hasn't been shown to be a thing, people still seem to get the wrong verdict. And then, on the other hand, even for horrible, deadly diseases like polio, for which we do have a vaccine, some people reach the other wrong verdict. So, yeah, but In these cases, it's at least supposed to be easy enough to get to the right conclusion. But then there is a third case, where immunity is found to be possible, but no vaccination is available. That is, where immunity is possible, but only through prior illness. What then? Should we try to get as many people infected with the virus quickly to reach herd immunity? What would be the costs? What would be the benefits? Should we embrace herd immunity as a policy in this situation? If you ask me, this is the only real question. Before I give some of my thoughts on this, I want to reiterate my statement from the previous video that I'm not an expert on anything and that I'm definitely not an expert on virology, epidemiology, immunology, or policy. And whereas I was pretty sure of what I had to say in the previous video about immunity not actually being an option we can rely on, I'm far less certain of the specific facts and data that I'll be presenting here. I did try to validate what I'm saying as much as I could, and I base my ideas here on what I learned. In the process of trying to validate this, I actually did find an article titled "Why We Probably Must Deliberately Infect," and thought, okay, there seems to at least be some basis for this idea. Let's see what they have to say. But it wasn't about infecting people in order to get to herd immunity. It was about why we have to deliberately infect volunteers in order to test potential vaccines. My attempts of validation shouldn't mean that we conclude that I know better than the experts. Everything I say here should be taken with a pillar of salt, not just a grain. And of course, if I have any significant errors, I welcome your corrections. So, alright, with that in mind, let's get to it. So, first of all, I'm not sure how it could ever be a good idea to try to get to herd immunity through infection. I mean, it's not going to mean fewer people get the disease, right? It can't. By definition, if we need X people, a certain percentage of the population, to get infected to stop the disease from spreading, then once we got to X infected people, the disease stops spreading. It shouldn't make any difference whether we get there in 2 weeks or 2 years. X still remains pretty much the same, so long as the size of the population doesn't change dramatically. In fact, not actively trying to get to herd immunity quickly actually means we might never get to X-infected people. Because if we don't rush it, there is a higher chance of a vaccine being developed in the meantime. So, at best, we get the same outcome as we would without actively trying to get there. At worst, more people get the disease, and more significantly, we get more people who are actively sick at any given point until we get there, which may lead to overload on health services, which could lead to far worse outcomes compared to having the same number of cases thinly spread over more time. The only theoretical situation I can think of where actively chasing herd immunity might make sense is if we're, for some reason, more concerned about having the threat of getting infected than we are with actually getting infected. Because while reaching herd immunity more quickly won't mean fewer people get sick, it will mean less time passes until the threat is significantly lowered. I don't really see this as reasonable prioritization, so I really don't think we'd want to rush to herd immunity. But I might be wrong. Maybe there are advantages to herd immunity that I haven't been able to think of myself, and that my Google search has failed to come up with. But there are definitely some costs to it also. The most important cost, as I mentioned, is that it means our healthcare systems will be under greater stress due to the amount of infected people at each point in time. Another cost, which I'd also mentioned already, is that it may lead to more sick people, but it cannot lead to less of them. But then there are other costs, and those costs require us to understand the specifics of COVID-19 a bit more. Without getting too technical, for a virus as infectious as SARS-CoV-2 to get to herd immunity without using other means like distancing and masks, a rough estimate of the proportion of the population that needs to be immune is 67%. Okay? Herd immunity isn't reached until about 2/3 of the population gets the virus. There's a link in the description below that explains the calculation if you're interested. Now, let's explore what that means in the context of this post. That is, in the Israeli context. I trust that you'll be able to extrapolate from that to your own situations. So for a country of about 8 million people, to enjoy herd immunity without any other measures and without a vaccine, we need to get about 5 million people infected with the virus. What would that look like? The first and most honest response we can give is that we don't know. Statistics on this virus are still only available as very broad ranges. We don't actually know how many people got the virus. We only know how many people have tested positive, which means we can't calculate things like death rate or chances of long-term complications. We don't even know what all these complications might be, but we do know of some. So let's be as charitable as we possibly can. Let's just try to see what would be the bare minimum costs. Just let me stress that these numbers are extremely optimistic. This really is a bare minimum. The real numbers are likely much, much higher. A random survey was conducted here in July, checking 70,000 people for antibodies. That survey concluded that roughly 1 to 3% of the population had been infected up to that point. The number of deaths due to COVID-19 at that point was 300. Of course, this is not everyone who would eventually die out of those 1 to 3% who were already infected. But again, we're trying to lowball it, so let's take the number of deaths as the final number and also assume the higher infection rate. Okay, let's assume that at that point 3% of the population had already contracted the virus, and let's assume that of those 3%, no one will die other than the 300 people who already did. That also makes the calculation really, really easy. For every 1% of the population here that gets the virus, 100 people will die. That means that for us to achieve the 67% infection rate that we need for herd immunity, we need to have 6,700 people die from the virus. This translates to a bit under 0.1% of the population dying from the disease. One death per 1,200 members of society, not per 1,200 COVID-related hospitalizations or per 1,200 people who get COVID symptoms, or even who are infected with the virus. No, 1 out of 1,200 members of society, including those who don't get the virus, including even those who are never exposed to it. 1 in every 1,200 people. And again, that's a remarkably optimistic number. It assumes very low death rates, and it assumes that these highly optimistic death rates won't increase because of the elevated stress on health services. But deaths are not the only price we pay for this fantasy of herd immunity. Some studies have found that even in those who are asymptomatic, more than half will show signs of damage, and nearly 80% will suffer damage to their heart. Of course, these effects are worse for patients who do suffer symptoms. Other studies have found brain damage in many patients, both symptomatic and asymptomatic, and elevated risk of stroke, even for young patients with no background conditions. Brain, lung, and heart damage aren't the only possible negative long-term effects of this disease. They're just the ones we know the most about. We are very likely to find more long-term negative consequences as we gain more knowledge. But let's say that nothing more will be found. And let's also say that these numbers are far too high. Let's say that it's not really 80%, it's only 20% of those that get the virus who will suffer any kind of long term health consequences, and that only 20% of them will suffer serious consequences that actually permanently change their lives. This means that more than an eighth of the population will endure some kind of long-term effects, and that nearly 3% will have their lives changed entirely. For us in Israel, that would mean we'll have 1 million people with long-term damage and about 200,000 whose lives will never be the same. For a country the size of the UK or France, the numbers are closer to 10 million and 2 million, respectively. And again, those numbers are very, very low estimates. So, in Israel, if we decide to strive for herd immunity, and if herd immunity is even possible, we need to be willing to accept that at the very least, 6,500 people will die, 200,000 will become chronically ill, and about 1 million will suffer less severe long-term consequences. Is this a price worth paying? Maybe. But how can someone bring this up without even mentioning that this is the price? And without any discussion of what we might be getting for it? This post that set me off contrasted closing down the economy with business as usual and herd immunity. But this isn't actually an adequate contrast, is it? I mean, even if all my extremely charitable assumptions hold somehow, this is still not business as usual. Especially if, as the post suggested, we get to herd immunity within a couple of months. If we have 5 million people catch the virus in 2 months, we're definitely not going to see business as usual. Much of the workforce will be too sick to work, or they'll have to take care of others. Many businesses will still suffer or even go under because of the disease, even if no lockdown or any other safety measures are implemented. Am I wrong in saying that you shouldn't try to promote something like that without even pointing these things out? I know that we can say the same about the costs that I listed. They're not fully saved if we don't strive for herd immunity. Some people are still going to die or have very long-lasting effects, even if we implement full lockdown. But unlike those people that I'm responding to, I'm not trying to hide that fact. And really, how is this presented in such a black and white way? I mean, is it really full lockdown versus business as usual? Can't we find something in the middle? Can't we implement security measures that try to slow down the spread of this virus without full lockdown? I guess if you think that speedy infections that's meant to bring about herd immunity as quickly as possible is a good thing, then there's no point talking about other measures to slow down the infection. I simply don't see how anyone could actually think that. And if someone does, it's up to them to make the case for it. Herd immunity is a really nice buzz phrase. It sounds good. It sounds like something we should be aspiring to. But is that really all you're promoting? Herd immunity for the sake of saying we achieved herd immunity? And finally, let's say that somehow I missed the point entirely. Let's say that herd immunity is its own goal, or that there is some really huge benefit to it that I missed. Let's say all that. Let's say that no matter the cost, we need to strive for herd immunity, and we need to get there as soon as we can. Shouldn't we still try to minimize the cost? If we're going to get 2/3 of the population infected, shouldn't we try to make sure that as many of those who get infected are also those who would be least affected by it? Those who are less likely to be a burden on the system because of it? Shouldn't we try to use herd immunity for its intended purpose, to help those who have less protection from the disease without it? Even if we actually decide that we want to infect as many people as possible as quickly as possible, is business as usual really the best way to get there? Maybe. but I don't think so. And if anyone wants to claim that it is, they have a huge burden of proof. A burden of proof that, as far as I've seen, no one has even tried to lift. And if someone tried to promote this without even an attempt to address this burden of proof, without even acknowledging that what they're saying isn't self evident, this person is not someone we should ever take seriously on anything. Not everyone needs to be able to come up with these points, but anyone who fancies themselves an expert absolutely must. We reached the point of the video where I'd normally invite criticism of what I said. And I do invite criticism, also this time, but with a slight difference. This time I don't really care very much about the specifics. It doesn't really matter if herd immunity would mean at least 1 million people with lingering injuries, or at least 500,000 or 2 million. I wasn't trying to give accurate figures, only to say that we should at least ask what the figures are. Don't get me wrong, if you can point me to a better analysis of what these numbers would be, that could be interesting. But it wouldn't change my point here, which is basically that you can try to promote a policy like this all willy-nilly without discussing what it might mean in terms of costs and in terms of benefits. I'd be much more interested in your takes on this more general, broad notion, but feel free to share whatever your thoughts are. If you managed to survive to this point, you really are a hero. Thank you. As usual, a little click on that like button goes a long way. Just don't forget to sanitize it when you're finished, as a courtesy to the next liker clicking after you. If you share this, that would be even better, though maybe it would make more sense to share the first part. Your call though. If you want to support my work and help me spread the word on critical thinking, sound epistemology, skepticism, and fact-based discourse, then other than commenting, liking, subscribing, and sharing, a great way to help would be to click one of the videos on the end screen or any other video on my channel. That helps teach YouTube that my videos are worth watching. More ways to help out, as usual, can be found in the description. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a good one.